So a move certainly in the right direction, but what more needs to be done?
I think, in terms of gender equality, we're doing quite well in political representation. I think at the higher echelons, you might argue that we could have more ministers, women ministers. But overall, as you mentioned, there are quite a few parliamentarians now. We've had the first female opposition Malay lady elected this election, which is great from a minority representation point of view. Yeah.
Well, Sudhir, when you look at what's been happening there and across the world with this pandemic, and it highlighted the huge number of migrants there is a big inequality issue, which has certainly been highlighted by the transmission of COVID-19.
Yeah, so I think if we look at socio-economic inequality, the coronavirus story here is really sort of a bifurcated story. You know, on the one hand, you have 80% of citizens and residents who've actually had quite a good response from the government. But if you look at the other end, you know, the 20%, sort of 1 million odd low-cost migrant laborers who we have, many of them from South Asia. Many of them live in these huge dormitories, you know, some of them, not all, but some of them in quite squalid conditions. It was sort of a disaster waiting to happen. So for them, you know, you've had the coronavirus sweeping through these dorms, and because of this problem with the dormitories, Singapore actually has more than 50,000 cases now, confirmed cases. And you know, we call it the worst humanitarian crisis since independence, actually. And so it's looking pretty bad, but it's a sort of a bifurcated response depending on how you look at it.
Absolutely, Sudhir. So with the election now behind them and the PAP, they're losing a few votes, certainly, but still firmly in power. Do they have a mandate? What sort of mandate do they have? What do they have to do?
So it's interesting because they won the election with 62% of the vote. You know, most political parties around the world would be celebrating with that kind of a vote share, but actually in Singapore, it was seen as a big disappointment. It's one of their lowest ever vote shares since independence in '65, and the opposition has made huge inroads. So for the first time, the opposition actually has 10 seats in our 93-seat parliament. We actually have a formal leader of the opposition, and so you actually see the possible beginnings of a two-party system in Singapore, which we've never had. We've effectively been a one-party state since independence. And I think getting back to inequality, what one clear signal from the electorate is that we want, you know, more attention paid to some of the socio-economic inequalities that have emerged over the past few decades. Singapore has one of the highest Gini coefficients among rich countries. And you know, there's inequality arguments at every end of the labor spectrum. So it's at the bottom you've had this high inflow of cheap, low-cost labor, which has depressed wages at the bottom. I think in the middle, you know, among middle-class professionals, there's also a sense that sort of high immigration has depressed wages a bit in the middle. And then at the top, you have this sense that Singapore is becoming a sort of a playground for the rich, you know, sort of a tax haven where the world's plutocrats and you know, a lot of multinationals sort of move their tax headquarters to Singapore and so on. So there are different aspects of the inequality debate in Singapore, and I think the election showed that the electorate, you know, wants the party to focus more on this.
So what is the policy prescription then? Do the rich need to pay more tax in Singapore?
I think that there are several things. You know, the one big argument is that we need more social protections for those at the bottom, right? So Singapore has always had this natural aversion to welfare, and many advocates of the Singapore model will say that this is one of the things that has made us successful. You know, very open, free economy with very little redistribution. So I think one of the policy prescriptions is a minimum wage. We don't have a minimum wage right now. We have sort of selected, you know, very selected wage increases for particular sectors. But I think the Workers' Party, which is the main opposition party, has come in and said that they're pushing for a minimum wage. There's also unemployment insurance, particularly important in a time of technological change and disruption. Singapore, of course, faces all these same forces that have been affecting other countries around the world. So I think minimum wage and unemployment insurance at the bottom. And yes, perhaps there might have to be particular tax increases, both for corporations and for some high-income earners to pay for that. So I think there's also at some point going to be increased discussion about wealth taxes, right? Singapore has no estate duties, no sort of capital gains tax. So I think there's going to be increased focus on whether we should institute some kind of wealth taxes as well in the country.